I think it comes back to what we were saying about the home and giving people homes that they can be proud of and live comfortably in. And coming back to a property that looks nice, feels good to be in, isn't drafty, has been properly maintained, gives people an enormous just sense of psychological safety and pride in their community. And retrofit is fundamental to that.
Hello. Welcome to Talking Place, the podcast bringing placemakers and storytellers together to talk about place. I'm your host, Tanisha Raffiuddin. I am the founder of Concept Culture, a creative agency in London, passionate about creating purposeful brands and telling powerful stories. In this episode, it is my absolute pleasure to talk place with Anna Moore. Anna Moore is CEO and co-founder of Domna, a turnkey energy efficiency retrofit service for private and social landlords. Anna is a leader in retrofit and energy efficiency. She sits on the National Retrofit Hub's private rental working group and the City of London Skills for a Sustainable Skyline Task Force, as well as chairs the Urban Land Institute's UK Innovation Council. We cover a lot of ground in this episode around the significant investment needed for retrofitting the UK's housing stock, the importance of communicating the health and financial benefits of home retrofit, and the roles of the government, local authorities, housing associations, community groups, and AI in driving progress. All right, let's talk place. Anna, welcome to Talking Place.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Amazing. And it's my pleasure to have you. Like I just said, I've been following your journey, yours and Chennai's with Domna. I've been rooting for you guys. And when you secured the investment, I can't tell you, my heart skipped a beat and I was so happy for you guys. And so I'm really excited about this conversation. So without giving too much away, why don't you tell our audience about your journey into retrofit, founding Domna and securing a record-breaking investment?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really been a privilege. I was a partner with McKinsey, spent about 10 years at the firm leading its UK construction real estate practice and co-leading its European sustainability strategy practice. And at a certain point, I thought, this is great, but retrofit to me is our most urgent decarbonization challenge. Anywhere from a fifth to a quarter of CO2 emissions come from home energy use, depending how you count. We have 6 million UK households that are in fuel poverty. And we waste about 9 billion pounds a year on excess energy bills. So we're poorer, colder, and less healthy because our homes are drafty and leaky. And I left my role as a partner to start the business in 2023 because I wanted to make a difference. And together with Colleen Konkal-Lissar, our chief technology officer, and our now exited co-founder Chennai, we started the business. We're now a team of 90 across the UK. We've been really, really privileged to have Osmosis ACD now as part of the group. Fantastic team there, and to have built out the retro team and others. And we're just getting started.
That is amazing. That's so inspiring. And I just love your story and your determination. And when we first met, you told me, how many ever VCs you approached, and then you finally secured the investment. So now it sounds like a fairy tale story, but there's been a lot of graft along the way, hasn't it?
Oh my gosh. I spoke to 210 VCs, family offices, private equity funds. We now are privileged to partner with Leon Capital, who have been a fantastic partner for us. I feel very strongly that the solution to retrofit is software and services. And so we didn't want to just do a VC-backed software solution. Somebody also needs to put insulation into walls to have real impact. And so we built our business as a buy and build, acquiring fantastic technical teams like Osmosis ACD and pairing that with the predictive stock assessment modeling that we do ourselves in-house. And so that led us down more of a path of private equity to fund that buy and build strategy. But for sure, it meant we were spending a lot of time fundraising and trying to find the right partner because it's a little bit of a different model, and really, really privileged to now be partnering with Leon.
Amazing. We will get into all of that very soon, but obviously this is a podcast about place. And it's a question I ask everybody on this podcast. What does place mean to you? And what does good look like?
For me, place is all about the home. And I think that's where it comes back to. At Domna, we work on about 15,000 homes a year across the UK, largely in social and affordable housing. And there, what does good look like? It's helping people live in healthier, safer, more comfortable homes that they can afford, and creating, if you will, pride and psychological safety in the home. We know that there are serious problems with damp and mold in a lot of our affordable and social housing stock. We know that there's very poor energy efficiency that drives up unaffordable bills. And it's really a privilege for us to be able to work on making people's homes healthier, happier, greener, more livable.
That's such a beautiful statement. Everything starts from the home, doesn't it? And one step further, what's your favorite place in the world?
I am very sentimental. And I'm Canadian originally, and my favorite place in the world is still our family cottage in Northern Ontario, little town called Parry Sound. For any hockey fans out there, Bobby Orr hails from Parry Sound. There'll probably be about 5 listeners who know who that is. But yeah, we go up still in the summers, spend a bit of time together as a family by the lake, and that's my favorite place in the world.
That's so, so beautiful. I've probably told you this. My younger sister lives in Canada, in Ontario and Toronto specifically. And I've spent a couple of summers exploring the Canadian countryside. And it's a very, very beautiful country. And there's little wonder why that place holds such a special memory for you. Well, thank you for sharing that. So now let's get into the nitty gritty. Can you outline what the challenge is in terms of retrofitting the UK's existing housing stock?
Our challenge in retrofit is fragmentation. We have 90 million homes across the UK that need to be upgraded to meet our energy efficiency, fuel poverty, and social value goals. So it's a huge potential investment opportunity. We see 20, 30, 40% post-retrofit valuation improvement. But there's also a lot of cost involved in getting there, about £570 billion that needs to get spent improving this stock. So the maths work, but getting access and getting good supply is hard, right? Because a lot of that stock is owned by owner-occupiers or smaller private landlords, which makes it tough for institutional investors to get in the market. And the government is never going to fund that $570 billion. So it's got to come from private capital. And we see a lot of our role as creating investable propositions for portfolio landlords and for investors who want to put money behind retrofit. Because I think our big challenge is stacking up what is a huge but fragmented market with capital that wants to come into that market.
I see. And so how does what you do at Domna, how is it different from other similar service providers?
We do a couple things differently. One, I mentioned earlier how important it is to us to combine software and services. And a lot of that problem of fragmentation we think is solved through better data and better efficiency. So historically, people would just rock up on site, do a retrofit assessment quite manually and charge a relatively hefty fee to do that. We start desktop. We have a predictive stock assessment tool with over 4 billion data points, 97% accuracy, predicting post-retrofit outcomes. And so we can pinpoint down to the unit level what actually needs to be done to this property, how much is it going to cost, what will it yield in terms of valuation improvement, PC performance, relying energy consumption change, rental yield, etc., which then allows landlords and owners to be a lot more targeted in where they spend time and resource on on-site works, right? So we do that kind of first software and services view. The other thing that I think makes us different is we understand that there's a business case that needs to be made here. We're true believers. We got into this business because we want to have social and environmental impact, but we understand that investors, asset owners, landlords need to see a financial return to make this sustainable over the long term. And so we spend a lot of time looking at what's the valuation improvement post retrofit, where is the evidence for green premium, what types of measures really achieve demonstrated value creation. Because in my view, we're only going to stick the landing on a huge transition if we can create value as well as values out of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, coming from your consultancy background, you're probably familiar with the language and the terminology and how to speak to uh, people in private finance and institutional investment. Coming back to what you said at the start about the 570 billion cost, and you said that the government can only do so much. So what about local authorities and housing associations? What role did they play in the larger picture of the national retrofit efforts? And in your view, have you found that it's a priority for them?
So, housing associations and local authorities, if you like, have been the first movers on retrofit. And the majority of our business is for housing associations and local authorities. It's the majority of the retrofit market today, and for good reason, right? We want to start with households that face fuel poverty and that are in the greatest need. And so I think HAs and local authorities have done a lot of the hard yards to get the market moving. And actually, average EPCs in social housing are much higher than in the owner-occupied and in the private rental markets. The role, I think, for them now is obviously continue that progress because there's still, over 1 million socially rented properties below EPCC that we need to work on, 1 million households across the UK in fuel poverty. But we need to also roll that model out to the private rental and owner-occupied markets. And I think there's been a bit of resistance historically, especially around supporting private landlords and a view of, okay, they need to sort that out. They're making money off of rent. But really, the change that we're trying to see is upgrading our homes for the benefit of everybody. And I think the GLA now has been a lot more forward-leaning and trying to think about what's a model that works to support private landlords and owner-occupiers in making this change. But we need to see a lot more leadership continuing there and spread out across the country.
That's interesting. So in terms of then policy, be it local or national, how is that impacting the progress of the retrofit agenda?
At the UK level, we hear a lot about this target of 1.5 million new homes. And I think we all know there's no way we're going to get there through new build development alone. I think the other challenge in trying to get there through new build development alone is those properties are then sold to the market at £300,000, £400,000 per unit. Those are not the people who don't have homes in the UK today, right? And so we could spend a huge amount of time and resource building properties that actually don't address where we have the most acute housing shortage. By contrast, we have over 1 million long-term vacant properties in the UK. And that's existing stuff we've already built that's tied up in probate, or the deed has been lost along the way, it's been vacated, nobody has repossessed it. So if you put those together, we've already built 2/3 of the stock that we want to put back on the market to address our housing shortage. And it will be a lot cheaper and easier to have a policy shift whereby we had compulsory purchase made easier for local authorities to allow them to take long-term vacant stock, invest in the retrofit, and either sell them into the market or use them as council-owned rental properties, whether that's social or privately rented. That, to me, is the single biggest policy shift that in a lot of ways would be a pen stroke for government, just easing compulsory purchase requirements, and would put 1 billion homes back into circulation.
That's so interesting. And, yes, reaching 1.5 million homes, it seems like a monumental task, but there's also something else that's not always talked about is the skills gap, or it is being talked about. But what's your take on the current skills shortage in the retrofit industry and how can we address it?
I have a slightly different view to many people on this topic, which is I think that supply follows demand. And we read about 500,000 green construction skills missing that the Construction Leadership Council has put out. Surely this is the case. We never struggle to find installers on large funded programs. right? So in the social housing and affordable housing side of what we do as a business, we can find good, reliable contractors, and that's because you have large volume, stable contracts. I think our challenge comes as we get into the private rental and owner occupied market where you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4 units at a time. And your bigger, more reliable, more financially stable contractor is not doing that kind of work. And so I think what we really need to set up are more area-based retrofit programs. It goes to your point about local authority leadership, whereby installers can sign themselves up for large volumes of low unit number retrofit programs and be, for example, the framework provider across an area or a community and get to a higher volume, because that's what really gets you into bigger snack bracket from contractors who have more skill, who are willing to lower price because there's economies of scale and more volume for them. I think that's our biggest impediment to getting the quantity and quality of skilled labor that we need.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, I mean, in terms of, people looking to upskill or pivot into the industry, retrofit seems to be the place to be. I mean, if the scale of the challenge is as large as it is, then there's a lot of opportunity there.
There's not an enormous level of apprenticeship that's needed to get into retrofit, right? A lot of the skills, when we talk about skills gap, what are we really talking about? What we need to do to retrofit is we need qualified retrofit assessors, coordinators, and designers. That I think should require a higher level of skill than it does today, closer to what chartered surveyors need to do. And we and others in the Association of Retrofit Consultants are pushing for that. I think good retrofit starts with good assessment. And then when we talk about the install side, yes, there are some highly technical skills required for example, heat pump installation. But a lot of what we're really talking about in retrofit is cavity wall insulation, loft insulation top-ups. These are relatively straightforward measures, a lot easier than much of what's involved in new build construction, where people could tool up quite quickly, right? So I think it's worth us being precise about what those skills are and where there are true gaps. And what I think gets in the way, therefore, is the fluctuation in grant funding programs. So, we see a lot of people entering the market when we have a big grant program. And then when we've got a 6-9 month break between programs, people leave because they can't get steady work. And so I think what we need in order to solve that skills gap is stability from government on the regulation, EPC minimums that allow people to really plan for volume of work, and stability in grant funding programs.
And are there any institutions or organizations that are currently doing a good job in this space in terms of upskilling people?
Obviously, Domna.
Obviously.
And I think that there's a lot of really good work being done by the Retrofit Academy to try to upskill. South London Skills Partnership is also doing really, really terrific work, including with South Thames Colleges Group, who have done a big push around this. There are a lot of universities that are doing quite a bit of work in the area as well. And so, we see terrific community-based programs. Joe Tasker has put a huge amount of energy behind that. So there are a lot of people doing really great work to provide more training opportunities. For me, the big thing is, if I think about the energy company obligation, which has been the primary driver of retrofit in this country over the last decade, there was a 9-month break between Eco Phase 3 and Eco Phase 4. A lot of businesses went bankrupt over that period. A lot of people left the sector. We can do as much as we like to try to create more apprenticeship and new programs, but if people can't work for 9 months, we will never meet the skills gap. So again, to me, this all starts with stability from government.
And so what advice then would you give to developers or housing associations looking to stack funding or build viable financial models for retrofit?
I think the value creation case for existing homes is really clear, and we're starting to see more purposeful aggregation of low EPC existing stock. For example, a landlord in the Cambridge area who has over 1,000 units aggregated now, another in West London with over 300 units. And that's because on average properties below the minimum energy efficiency standard trade at least a 20% valuation gap. We did some work on about 412 units in the Midlands, looking at pre and post retrofit actual transaction, right? Not just estimated valuation data, and saw a 67% average valuation gap.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the retrofit, we all get a bit scared about the cost of retrofit. At a 67% valuation premium, that cost more than pays for itself. And you're starting to see lower mid-market private equity beginning to look at this space and try to aggregate, and opportunistic aggregation by landlords who are building up bigger portfolios, acquire, retrofit, and either sell or hold them. And I think the bigger institutions who are pivoting into single family and competing for the same low volume of house builder stock really risk missing the boat on a once in a generation opportunity, because once those homes are done up, they're done.
Yeah, yeah. So you've alluded to it earlier, but coming back to the role of private finance and institutional investment, how big is the opportunity for them in scaling retrofit?
Yeah. So if you think about the amount of stock in the UK that's below EPCC, it's about £5 trillion worth of stock. Making a conservative assumption of at least 20% valuation improvement for properties that fall below EPCC, that's about £1 trillion at stake. So there's a huge value creation story for us. I think the specific roles that private capital can face, one is doing that aggregation. Because I think bigger institutions that can't get their heads around acquiring in blocks of 20, 30, 40 are not going to do that work. So it's going to come from lower mid-market real estate private equity players who do that aggregation, take that 67% valuation improvement, where you quite handily get yourself into a high 20s IRR through the stabilization phase, and then exit it to bigger institutions. I think the other role for private capital is in doing large funding vehicles for housing associations and local authorities. And you've seen several examples of that kind of model, but I think we need structured finance to get there, because the government spends about £2 billion a year today in grant money toward retrofit. It's probably more than most people think is being spent, but it's a lot less than £570 billion in total, right?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you think about people like PIC, like Lloyd's, like AXA, who have started to do really interesting structured finance. We are really excited about some of those models that we're seeing.
Amazing. And so we've talked about the bigger players. What about the smaller organizations or community-led initiatives? How can they compete for funding then if the space is going to be dominated by larger players?
Well, I think it goes back to the big challenge being fragmentation, right? And there's a bridge that we need between 1, 2, 3 units at a time and 2, 3, 400 units at a time that a bigger institution can get their heads around. And I think that's where there's a role for community-based organizations, especially with the owner-occupied market, because housing associations and local authorities, it's already consolidated stock. An institutional investor can put the money behind the retrofit, see a great long-term return, fabulous. Private rental, I think, is going to get sorted through a lot of the aggregation that we spoke about, with either larger private landlords building bigger positions or lower mid-market private equity doing the same. Owner-occupiers need to get solved through a different kind of mechanism. And that's where I think community-based schemes can be really powerful. And a lot of that is, of course, it's the funding and giving people access to economies of scale and approved installers, all of that. But I think it's also just getting good, trustworthy advice that helps people be confident that what they're doing to their home makes sense. Because if you think about it, to our conversation about place earlier, your home is your biggest single investment, but very few people are subject matter experts in it, right? And so I think community-based schemes can do a lot to help owner-occupiers understand what their options are, get good, trustworthy advice, and get a good, trustworthy tradesperson.
So one of the first projects that I worked on after I set up Concept Cultures a couple of years ago was working with a consortium to develop a home retrofit scheme in Oxfordshire. And the result was a new company called Cozy Homes Oxfordshire. And we worked together with the partners at the time
to create this brand for Cozy Homes Oxfordshire, and it was very much about community-led retrofit. And so I learned a lot about the power that these community groups have all across the country. And, these guys are very climate literate, they're passionate about it, and they had the means to retrofit their own homes. If I think about myself, like I own a home, I don't think I would put my own money into retrofitting. I would rather, it be funded. But this brings me to the next section of our conversation around community and, social impact. So we talk a lot about community engagement. So what does community engagement look like in terms of retrofit? And, how do you go about getting a community on board to go down the retrofit route?
We spent a huge amount of our time on resident engagement. A lot of the work that we do is in social housing, where the housing association may well have said yes, but you're still going into somebody's house and they need to see benefit from you poking around. And so a lot of what we do is communicating clearly and honestly with people. I'm going to be turning up on site. This person's going to have their ID badge. This is what they're going to be doing. The benefit is then going to be lower bills, less risk of damp and mold, more comfortable property. But, it is invasive. And so there's a huge need to, I think, communicate honestly and clearly with people about what's actually involved in a retrofit process. Try to make it as non-intrusive and comfortable as possible and treat people with respect and dignity when you're going through their home. Keep the place tidy. Don't leave a skip outside, all of that stuff. And then be really clear about what the benefits are, because retrofit makes people healthier, more comfortable, helps them live more sustainably in their homes, sustainably financially as well as environmentally, right? But the process can be invasive. And a lot of it comes back to just being honest and upfront with people.
Absolutely. And so what are the most common concerns or maybe misconceptions that people may have had about retrofit, and how have you gone about addressing them and building that trust that you've talked about?
I think the two biggest misconceptions are this is going to cost £50,000 and I'm going to have to decant from my property for a month. Neither of those things needs to be true. On average, most homes are at an EPCD. Getting them up to an EPCC will typically cost around £5,000 to £7,000, right? So we're not talking about an enormous amount of money in spite of what is often floated in the press.
Mm.
And you can work incrementally, right? Move up to an EPCC, then in a few years when you have the money or there's a grant program, move up to an EPCB and work incrementally over time. And a lot of what we're talking about doing to homes can be non-intrusive, right? So solar panels, cavity wall insulation, loft insulation. These are all relatively quick measures that don't require somebody to vacate their property. And so to me, the biggest misconceptions are this has to be a huge single shot passive house program. You can start incrementally in work packages that you can afford and do it over time.
And you mentioned earlier that, yes, so maybe the local authority, the housing association has said yes, but you still might face resistance from the residents themselves. So what role then does the local authority and the housing association play in getting the community buy-in?
An incredibly important, critical role.
Okay.
We do all of our communication to residents with the approval of and joint branding of housing associations and local authorities. The tenant is their tenant and their customer. And so, we respect their preferred communication channels, how they like to message, all of that. And it's incredibly important and powerful to have a tenant liaison officer that the resident trusts and knows and who's in the community to help guide us on how do we best communicate with residents, what's going to register well, who are also pivotal influencers within the community.
Absolutely.
Right? Because there will usually be a couple of people living in the block who are really trusted and respected.
That's right.
And, who can host a tenants and residents association meeting that we can come to and explain some of the benefits. And so it's really about, if you like, the ground game of resident engagement.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And it's, again, that going back to my experience a couple of years ago, that's what we did as well through that project, was setting up meetings and one-to-ones and kind of like not necessarily educating, but kind of communicating what the values and the benefit would be. And in terms that they would understand. So not necessarily in technical jargon, but more about how would it improve your quality of life. And I've always fundamentally thought about that piece around communication about sustainability, that ultimately we have to get across how it will impact the everyday person's life beyond energy savings and beyond a property uplift. But how do you think retrofit can reshape a community's identity and sense of place? Coming back to placemaking and the benefits of retrofit beyond energy and carbon savings.
I think it comes back to what we were saying about the home and giving people homes that they can be proud of and live comfortably in. And coming back to a property that looks nice, feels good to be in, isn't drafty, has been properly maintained, gives people an enormous just sense of psychological safety and pride in their community. And retrofit is fundamental to that, right? It feels awful to come back to a home that has black mold. And so we solve that problem. The other element of retrofit in community making comes back to what we were saying earlier around empty homes. We have over 1 million long-term vacant properties in the UK that attracts antisocial behavior, right? And if we were to systematically retrofit them, put people who are unhoused today back into homes that they can live in, can take pride in, can look after, it goes a long way to making our streets safer as well.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Safety, healthy, happy communities is what we all want for not just this country, but everywhere in the world. So as you're a tech company, obviously you probably have views on AI. So how do you see AI influencing, retrofit in terms of, the assessment? You said a good retrofit starts with good assessment, decision making, design, delivery. What's your take on the role of AI?
Sure. We have a machine learning tool. We use that to assess properties outside in. Given the volume of what we're talking about, right? 19 million homes that need to be retrofit. There is simply no way we're going to get there unless we use data in a smart way and use machine learning to do that. And we all complain about the quality of data that we have on the built environment. Machine learning allows us to correct for errors that are known in data sets, allows us to detect errors in data sets, allows us to make inferences about properties where we're missing information in a much smarter way than a lot of the Excel or Microsoft Azure-based products that were available 5-10 years ago. And so I think there's an enormous role to play in carving up what is otherwise quite a fragmented, complicated problem.
And are there any risks of relying too heavily on data and automation in place-sensitive projects like retrofit?
I don't think we're ever going to fully, nor should we, fully automate the assessment, coordination, and design stages. Someone still needs to look at a property. That ought to be a tech-enabled process. And it goes back to why we care so much about providing both software and services. I also get nervous when I see software-only solutions because you do need the judgment of a retrofit assessor, a retrofit coordinator, a chartered surveyor. But that should be a judgment that is informed by rich fact base and proven methodologies. And so we see it more as software and services, not as a fully automated process.
So there will always be opportunity for a human in carrying out assessments.
And in large part also because it goes back to your point around community and place. People are living in these homes. They have preferences about what they're trying to solve. And so the recommendations that we make when we go into somebody's house aren't just about the technical feasibility of what we're doing. It's also about how somebody's going to live in their property. What are they trying to achieve? Is this about making an EPC band jump because you're a private landlord trying to comply with MEES? Is this about reducing CO2 emissions because you're dedicated to sustainability? Is this about financial return, right? You need to have that level of nuance and judgment in order to serve a client well.
So I guess that's good news for people listening in terms of...
Indeed, and we are actively...
AI is not going to take their jobs.
And we are actively recruiting, so get in touch with us if you fancy a career as a surveyor.
Yeah, I might consider that actually, the way things are going. But yeah, coming back to future gazing as we're wrapping up our conversation. So how do you see the conversation around retrofit evolving in the next 5 to 10 years in the UK?
I think we need to put a lot more focus on it. The government has been consumed by this 1.5 million new homes target. They need to recognize that we've built 2/3 of that target with long-term vacant dwellings and get serious about easing compulsory purchase to make that happen. We also need to see governments stick the landing with higher minimum energy efficiency standards. We do a lot of work with the National Residential Landlords Association. We're really proud of that and of the work we do to support private landlords. And I know that higher MEs is challenging, but we're doing it because there are 6 million UK households in fuel poverty. We waste £9 billion a year on excess bills. We've got to improve our homes and help people live happier, healthier lives. The government does need to make it easier for landlords to comply by offering better advice and more grant funding. And so we need to see a shift of focus there too.
So to follow up, if you had one call to action for the industry, what would it be?
For industry, I think it's don't miss the boat. There's £1 trillion potentially at stake from improving and retrofitting stock. And I think the larger institutions are scared by that, but there's an enormous amount of value that will be captured by opportunistic landlords and by lower mid-market private equity. And so my call to action would be don't miss out.
Don't miss out. Get on it. Join the retrofit movement. Okay, so then if you could ask the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, to, enact a single law or regulation to address the challenge of retrofit in the UK, what would it be?
Yeah. I'm going to give two, and those are
two. Go for it.
Ease compulsory purchase so that we can repossess and retrofit those million long-term vacant properties. Addresses the housing shortage, and it is a heck of a lot faster and easier than new build. And stick the landing on raising the minimum energy efficiency standard.
Right. Well, Prime Minister, if you're listening, you heard it here on Talking Place. That's what you need to do. So what's the legacy you hope to leave through Domna?
The legacy that we hope to leave is that we've made a meaningful contribution to retrofitting those 19 million homes in the UK that need to be worked on. And by doing that, alleviate fuel poverty for the 6 million households that face that today.
And I hope that does come to fruition for everyone's collective health and well-being. So what's next for you, Anna?
Well, we are continuing to build the business. We're a growing team. We're 90 people today. We're continuing to expand and actively recruiting, actively partnering with new businesses. So hopefully long may it continue.
Long may it continue, indeed. Well, thank you so much. That's been really insightful. My brain is buzzing. That's been a very inspirational conversation. I made a gazillion notes, then lots of things for me to look up after this conversation. But that brings us to the fun part of our little podcast, which is called the Know Your Neighborhood quiz. So you've listened to the podcast, so you know the drill. I'm going to ask you 3 facts, or I'm going to state 3 facts, and all you have to do is tell me whether they're true or false. The facts have been sourced from the internet, and they've not been cross-verified for accuracy, but whatever's on my notes stands. And your neighborhood of choice is London Bridge. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's do it. All right. Fact number 1. The London Bridge we see today is the original medieval stone bridge, just refurbished.
False.
Correct. Yes, that's right. I didn't know this, actually. The medieval bridge was demolished in the 19th century.
And I thought part of it ended up being sold to some tycoon in Texas.
Yeah, in Arizona. That's right. Yes. You learn something new every day. All right. 1 out of 3. Fact number 2. London Bridge has more listed buildings than any other London borough.
False, I think.
That's correct. Yeah, 2 for 3. So while London Bridge has many heritage assets, particularly around Borough High Street and Tooley Street, it is part of Southwark Council, which overall doesn't have the most listed buildings. Westminster holds that title. Very good. 2 for 3. So that brings us to our last and final fact. Fact number 3. London Bridge is one of the first areas in London to experiment with mean well use strategies in railway arch spaces.
Definitely true.
Amazing. That's right. 3 for 3. Wow. You really know your neighborhood. Well done. That's amazing.
A neighbor of mine calls herself the Queen of Bermondsey Street, so maybe I can challenge for that title.
Yeah, you're the queen of London Bridge. So, meanwhile use, the temporary occupation of spaces before permanent development, has been key around London Bridge with creative uses of railway arches for independent retail bars and work spaces. Amazing. That's not easily done, Anna. You're probably only like the third person who's got all three right. So, that's another accolade to add to your CV, if you like. But anyway, this has been so much fun. I've learned a lot from this conversation about, the challenge that we have, how to address it, and what companies and organizations like Domna and yourself are doing in this space. And like you said, there's so many passionate people. I mean, I've certainly encountered so many passionate people in the retrofit community who truly believe in what they're doing and are so committed and dedicated to the cause that it gives me a lot of hope that we will systematically, one house at a time, get to where we need to get to.
Thank you so much for having me. I am such a huge fan of you and of this podcast, and it was an absolute pleasure.
Amazing. That's so sweet. Thank you for your kind words, Anna. So all that's left for me to do is thank you for being a part of Talking Place and Talking Place with me, and we'll talk soon.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to join the conversation on social media with the hashtag #TalkingPlace. I would also love for you to leave our podcast a review and subscribe to all our podcasts and YouTube channels so you don't miss an episode. There's so much more to explore when it comes to creating good places, and I'm excited to do a deep dive into other topics with you in our next episode. I'm Tanisha Raffiuddin, and it's been my pleasure to be your podcast host. Thank you for listening. See you again next time, where we'll continue Talking Place. Talk soon.